Hi, we continue in 1 Samuel 17 today with the B part of the chiasm you can see on the right side of the screen as the Philistine taunts Israel. We saw last time the description of Goliath standing as if it was a stationary portrait with all the description of his height and all his armor and weaponry. And we looked at how that was an echo of various Greek images of single combat and of the specific implements of war and battle that would be in the Greek influence, which would suggest that although he's the Philistine, and that the Philistines are in contrast here with the servants of Saul, as we'll see in a minute, that the Philistines themselves may behind the scenes be servants of somebody else. That will never be named in the story, but perhaps the authors understood something about that the Philistines weren't as free as Goliath suggested they are, and they could make Israelites be. But that's behind the story, and of course that depends on when we think the story is written, and we're not going to get into all that. If you're not sure about how all those issues come together, I encourage you to watch the introductory video to this unit here and a couple of videos ago. So we're picking up here in verse 8, and I titled this episode Goliath Trash Talks the Israelites because that's really what's happening here. And we'll see that's the mutual pairing here in the B and the B part chiasm, and the B1 part, David will trash talk him back. So I'm about to show you now this little clip from a classic trash talk is probably more fitting for the B1 one. But since we're dealing with trash talking, I might as well show it here as young Cassius Clay, who was certainly the underdog, announces his intentions against the heavyweight champion, Sonny Liston.
I'll stop the people before the fight, and I'll stop them right there in the track and let the world hear this. I'm going to whoop you. And if I whoop you, will you crawl across the ring and kiss my feet?
Kiss your feet. Yeah.
Don't get out of it, will you?
Yeah.
All right, hold it. Don't be trying to, I'm not joking or trying to get
Listen,
What?
listen, don't you make me that same promise, because I'm not going to be around that long. Wait until you come to kiss my feet.
You're not calling.
So as you can see from that little video, little clip of that there, that's not serious in the scheme of things, although if you go on to watch more of that young Cassius Clay before, of course, he was Muhammad Ali, says, I'm so ready to fight him. If I saw him on the street, I'd take him on right now. That's just publicity talk, and everybody has a little smile on their face, and they know that's just to do what Cassius Clay was so good at, which is to make boxing something that everybody couldn't wait to see. But our story here is something a little more serious, isn't it? It definitely involves life and death, not just of David and Goliath, but the freedom of these two peoples, the Philistines and the Israelites, and maybe behind the scenes the Judahites. So let's look up close and see what the Philistine here, not named Goliath, but simply as he is throughout, with two exceptions, simply the representative of these people, what he has to say, and the politics of that as we go. So as we do, I also want to note that we've been looking at how the Septuagint and the Masoretic text differ greatly here. The black part, which we'll get to when we follow, we're looking at this part here now, is in the Masoretic text, but not in the Septuagint. So when we finish today, the Septuagint text goes directly from here, when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid, to David said to Saul, let no one's heart fail. And it skips all the business about David and his family, which is a key part of the story, as certainly as we have it now. So just to keep that in mind, it doesn't affect what we're looking at today, but will affect what we're looking at next time. So putting the chiasm back up, and I'd also put for a moment the atlas back up, because we saw last time the story starts with a lot of description of where they are here, and then there's no description of place at all. Then it's just man on man and people against people, and it could be almost anywhere, other than the scenario that he's calling across the valley from one mountain to the other. So I guess I'll just leave this up and we can look and see the language of this as we go here. So as Falkman notes, Goliath's speech here is echoed by David's speech, and that's what we see in the chiasm. He stood and shouted, and the New RSV over-translates here Vaikra, which simply means that he called. It assumes shouting, because if you're going to call from one mountain to another across a valley, you must be shouting. But the word is simply called. And he calls to the ranks of Israel, to them gathered for battle there, and is going to challenge that immediately. So he shouts to the ranks of Israel. Notice not to Saul, he doesn't pick out the king here, but just to the soldiers on the ground. And there may be a reason for that. Why have you come out to draw up for battle? And notice that he doesn't ask about their ability at first. He asks their reason. Why are they doing this? The assumption behind the rhetorical question, which of course will not be answered, is that they're going to get destroyed. Um, but so far in 1 Samuel, there have been victories both ways. Remember, Jonathan in chapter 14 had the victory at Mishmash Pass over the Philistines, but the Philistines have also chased Saul and his people. So it's not obvious who would win here, even though from a historical perspective, the Philistines with their iron-wheeled chariots and swords certainly seem to have a great advantage in a war against the Israelites, who do not have swords and things because the Philistines control smithing, as we heard earlier in the book. So, with those situations in mind, he asks, why have you come out to draw up for battle? The word only used a few times here, but we saw it once earlier at the very beginning in the introduction. We'll see it one more time. And then he asks another rhetorical question. Am I not a Philistine? Literally, the Philistine. And that's really important here because he's not just simply any old Philistine. He represents the Philistines, and it'll be named over 20 times in this chapter that he's simply the Philistine. And as we saw last time, that's a little bit of the othering of the Philistines. And yet, from Goliath's perspective, which is what we're hearing here, it's a proud claim. And notice the contrast of what he makes between himself and his would-be opponents here. Am I not the Philistine? And you are servants or slaves of Saul. Literally slaves of Saul. And so, as my note below says, just from my own notes, the Philistine sees what Samuel predicted, is that the people would be slaves to their king. And also note here that Goliath offers no ethnic or national titles like Israelites, but instead their servitude to their king. So he's perhaps suggesting that they're slaves of a king who's too cowardly to come out and fight for himself. Like, it would be the king who would go out, and there are many stories from the Greek narratives that we saw last time are echoed here, at least in the type scene of single combat, where they were leaders of the people, if not kings, who would lead in battle. Later in 2 Kings, perhaps at the time that this story was, if not written, at least edited, King Josiah himself was killed in battle going up against the Egyptians. So there's certainly evidence for that in the Bible, and it could well have been in the mind of the audience if the story was written in that time period. And so what he's suggesting is, we Philistines are free and not serving anybody outside ourselves, but you soldiers here are having your lives put at risk by another person, by Saul. And why would you want to do that? And so that's what we hear his first call to them, and that's why he's not addressing Saul. He's in many ways trying to separate out the people from their king. And then he goes on to say, choose a man for yourself. And the Hebrew is confused here, as many scholars have noted. The Masoretic text has something that's incoherent here, baru lechem, to eat bread. And although I noted last time, then we can see it here from the key words that are used in this chapter, there is this word to fight, which is a play on lechem. And of course, David is from Bethlehem, where his father Jesse is the Bethlehemite. And so there might have been a word play originally there, but most translators think it was a scribal error. And other ancient versions, older than the Septuagint, older than the Masoretic, read bakar here rather than baru, to choose. And the Septuagint has a klego, which is the normal verb for to choose. So that's what we have here. So choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. That's the express call for single combat. And then he offers the conditions here. Not to kiss his feet, but this. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. Again, there's a lot going on there. Notice that Saul is not mentioned. So that if he is able to kill me, then we will be your servants. But notice it doesn't say we'll be Saul's servants. Maybe that's assumed, but it's not said. So there's an interesting question there. We have to look at the detail a little more closely. The word for able here, yakal, is twice in this verse, once for the Philistines and once for the Israelites, but used again later. And it suggests an ability to endure. And it's answered negatively by Saul in verse 33. Let's look at that just briefly here, where Saul said to David, you are not able to go up against this Philistine to fight, for you are just a boy, and he's been a warrior from youth. So we'll see that when the time comes, Saul is on Goliath's side in the sense he thinks that David is not the one who is able to fight, and he's going to end up getting Saul and the rest of the Israelites enslaved to the Philistines. And as we've seen in the earlier parts of the Saul story, Saul seems much more concerned about his own fate and his relationship with Yahweh than he is about the Israelites as a whole. Although not 100%, he's a complex character, not a one-dimensional villain. So if he is able to fight with me, again, the translation is confused there, and kill me or smite me, as my note here also says, it can mean smite or kill. It can literally means to hit, but the assumption is kill more than just defeat, because this would be a battle to the death, and of course that's what it'll turn out to do. Then we, speaking on behalf of himself, but of course it wouldn't include Goliath, as my note says, because he'd be dead, so Goliath speaking on behalf of the Philistines. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. Literally be a slave for us, and get, Goliath adds that, as my note has below here. This is different than we will be your servants. This is you will serve us. And as Falkman notes, this addition betrays Goliath's desire, the slave driver who incidentally directly drove the Saul of verse 8d from his position, as we just noted. So, notice the narrator adds another, and the Philistine said, and he is already speaking, so this is technically not necessary. He's still speaking. But what it suggests when there are multiple inbreakings from the narrator to suggest somebody's talking while they're still talking, is that these are what we might call pull quotes. These are like greatest hits of his taunting, the key things that he said out of a long period of talking. Because we'll see later, it's suggesting he stood there for 40 days and taunted at them. So we should hear this as the key points that are being extracted from a larger amount of trash talk, much like I posted a 20-second clip from a video that was several minutes long. And so that was my note there. So today I defy the ranks of Israel. First here, but a number of times, as we see 5 times in our passage here. It can also mean to fault or disgrace or shame, and we'll see that later. And if we translate it that way here, we can hear more that's at issue. So defy suggests that he's acting independently, but disgracing or shaming is something more. It's not about him, it's about them. It's about what he's doing to them. And among nations, there's much concern about that kind of disgrace or shame. We see it today in modern politics, that people who don't go to war are shamed and seen as not, quote, real men, in the kind of militarist macho that we see in patriarchal cultures, and war is almost always out of a patriarchal culture. So we see that he's suggesting to make them look female, to make them look weak and like they're not capable of taking part in this kind of battle among real men. Even though gender is not mentioned here. But we'll see that a theme is throughout. This is certainly a patriarchal text, although there are women in it. They're all subject to the control of men, with 1 or 2 exceptions here and there, as we'll see. She says, give me a man. And literally, ze here is the demonstrative pronoun often used in tones of derision. I didn't put it here like it is in a number of the others in the orange, 20 times in here. I didn't highlight them all because it seems so distracting that there's no this in the translation, that give me would be confusing. But I'll point them out when they're there, like this one here. So give me this man, which is to say, like, this nobody, but we don't see a this man, so the translation is a man, and we don't know who he's looking at. David's not even there exactly at the moment, and so that's not clear. So who the Philistine is referring to is not clear. And that we may fight together, literally as one or united. And although Gladwell doesn't bring this up in the video and the book that I just showed, but we'll look at a little bit more later when we get to the aftermath of the actual battle, this seems at one level to be an invitation to the kind of intimacy of fighting that the Philistine is expecting. Because this would be literally hand-to-hand combat, and that David would come close to him and that the Philistine would overwhelm him with his physical force. But spoiler alert, that's not exactly what happens. The term is only used one other time elsewhere in Samuel, and of course, since unity is a positive term here, the Philistine is using it ironically, is to suggest we'll be united until one of us, and obviously your man from his perspective, is dead. And then we get to the response. After that trash talk we hear in verse 11 here, as Falkman notes below, once again, as in chapter 13, the balance of power appears to be disastrously disturbed in favor of the attackers from the coastal districts, and once again deliverance appears to be impossible. But what about Jonathan? Which was hinting at, as I was noting, that back in earlier chapters, Jonathan, without even telling his father Saul, was victorious against the Philistines. So where is he now? And that's not just a random question, because as soon as this battle is over, Jonathan will appear and befriend David. So he's clearly around, but his absence from the story here is something that Falkman is drawing attention to. And it's a perfectly good question. Why would Saul not want to engage his own son as the representative? He obviously doesn't want to let Jonathan get killed, but as we recall, Saul, he was willing to kill Jonathan over eating honey, and it was only the loyalty of the soldiers to Jonathan that saved Jonathan's life. So we've hardly seen Saul as a model father here so far. And in relation to his daughter, Michal, we'll also see him not exactly as a model father, at least not in the way we might imagine fatherhood being modeled. And so when Saul and all Israel heard this, notice that the Philistine is addressing Israel, even though he mentioned Saul. He wasn't talking to Saul. He was talking to the soldiers about, are you not servants of Saul? But Saul is plainly hearing that he's not even being dignified by being named here. So when Saul and all Israel, but not Judah apparently, heard these words, notice the contrast in verse 24 with saw. And notice it's also not in, it's here in contrast with seeing his enormity and all his weapons. It's not that that terrifies him, it's the words of the Philistine. And so we'll be engaging that throughout the story of how much is in the ears and how much is in the eyes. The narrator, the writer here, has certainly put much of the Philistine in our eyes, much more than we see of David and much more than we see of Saul. But it's the words that terrify the Israelites here. And they're described in two terms. They were dismayed here, or it can mean shattered here, and it's only one other time in 1 Samuel, following a pattern I showed last video, and we'll continue to see that one of the bases for scholars to think that this chapter comes from a later period is how many words are used in it that are not used elsewhere in the books of Samuel, or many not even in the Deuteronomistic history, suggesting vocabulary from a different context. So they're dismayed or shattered here, and notice the contrast with the unity, the temporary unity that the Philistine offers, with the effect of his words was to shatter the Israelites completely, and greatly afraid. And as we'll see a number of times, there's Saul's fear that we see here, and we'll see it in chapter 18, and then way later when Saul is greatly afraid of David. So that's the setup of our chiasm, and the next time we're going to note that to continue, we're going to look at the Masoretic text here, but when we get to the C1 part, we'll note how different it would sound if we didn't have all this in our minds and hearts and ears as we get to the verse 31. See you next.